There is a pill organizer on my kitchen table that my wife Eleanor bought me the year her own health began to decline. Pale blue plastic. The days of the week printed in small white letters across each compartment. She picked it out without making a fuss about it, set it on the counter, and said simply, "So you don't forget." I have never forgotten. On a Tuesday morning in early November, I sat down at that table with my coffee and opened the organizer the way I do every morning before the first sip. Wednesday's compartment was full. Thursday was full. But Tuesday was empty. Not because I had forgotten. The refill had been due at Frank's pharmacy the previous Monday. Frank had called to tell me it had been canceled. This was the third time in 4 months. I sat in that empty compartment for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone. I did not call my son. I called Frank. To understand why that choice mattered, I need to take you back 2 years. My name is Raymond Aldred. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 31 years maintaining the buildings of the same school district where my son Derek learned to read, learned to drive, and eventually learned that his father was worth more dead than alive. I don't say that with anger. I say it because it's true, and because the truth is the only thing I have left that nobody can cancel. I retired 4 years ago, not because I was ready, exactly, but because Eleanor needed me home. She had been diagnosed the previous spring, and the kind of care she required wasn't something you could schedule around a work shift. So I filed my paperwork, turned in my keys, and became what I needed to be. That's what you do. My days have a rhythm now that I've built carefully, the way you build anything that needs to hold. I'm up at 5:40. Coffee is made by 5:50. I check the pill organizer before the first sip. That's not anxiety, it's just sense. Eleanor bought me that organizer the week my cardiologist first used the word management. Pale blue plastic. Days of the week in white letters. She said it in the same tone she used when she told me to wear a coat. Practical, loving, no argument expected or given. She's been gone 4 years now. Sometimes I still set 2 cups out without thinking. I catch myself, put one back, and that's that. I don't call it grief anymore. I call it Tuesday. The sacrifices I made for this family were never secret, but they were never announced either. When Eleanor's home care costs began climbing, I worked 3 additional years past the retirement date I had originally planned. $41,000 over those 3 years, give or take. I never showed Derek the receipts. He asked once how we were managing, and I told him we were fine. That was the truth, but only because I made it the truth. When Derek was 22 and needed his first car, I co-signed the loan. When he missed 2 payments in the first year, I covered them quietly and never mentioned it. When his small business collapsed 2 years ago, I handed him $8,000 from my savings account and asked him nothing about how it happened. A man's dignity matters. I know what it feels like to need help, and hope no one makes a ceremony of giving it. I want you to understand something about the way I've always thought about Derek. He was distant in the way that ambitious people are sometimes distant, always somewhere else in his head, always measuring something. I told myself that was drive. I told myself the Sunday calls that stopped weren't indifference, just busyness. There's a coat hanging on the hook by my back door that I haven't worn since retirement. It still smells like machine oil and floor wax. I keep meaning to move it. I never do. It reminds me of a version of this family that felt simpler. Something shifted in Derek after Eleanor's funeral, not suddenly. More like a door that slowly settles off its frame. You don't notice it at first. You just notice one day that it doesn't close properly anymore. I told myself he was grieving, that it would pass. I was wrong about that. Derek, at 12 years old, used to follow me around on Saturday mornings while I worked on things around the house. He didn't help much, but he asked questions constantly. How does this work? Why does it do that? What happens if you do it the other way? I never got tired of the questions. That's the boy I raised. Curious, present, fair. At 19, he called me every Sunday evening from his dormitory. Not long calls, 10 minutes, sometimes 15. He'd tell me what he was studying and ask what I'd been doing, and I'd tell him about whatever small project I'd gotten into that week. Those calls mattered more than he probably knew. At 27, he came home for Christmas and spent an entire afternoon helping me fix the back fence. We didn't talk much. We just worked. When we finished, he stood back and looked at it and said, "That'll hold." I remember thinking that was one of the better things a person could say. At his mother's graveside, 3 years ago, he cried in a way that seemed entirely real. I put my hand on his shoulder. He leaned into it. I believed in that moment that whatever else was difficult between us, the foundation was still solid. The first warning sign came 8 months after Eleanor passed. Derek called on a Sunday, same as always, but the conversation drifted somewhere new. He asked carefully and not unkindly whether I had gotten around to thinking about the estate arrangements, whether I had a clear plan in place, whether I'd spoken to anyone about it recently. I told him everything was in order and I moved the conversation somewhere else. I did not think much of it at the time. People ask about these things. It's practical. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, which was something I had always done freely and perhaps too often. The second sign was harder to explain away. During a routine visit to my doctor's office, the receptionist, a young woman named Brenda, who had worked there for years and knew my face well, mentioned in passing that my son had called a few times recently. She seemed to assume I knew. She said he had been asking general questions about my condition, about long-term management, about what the doctor monitored, and how often. She said it lightly, the way you mention something you assume is common knowledge. I thanked her and said nothing else. I drove home and sat with that for a while. It was Frank who said it plainly, the way Frank said most things, without drama, and without looking away. We were at the diner one Tuesday morning, the usual table by the window, and he set his coffee down and said, "Raymond, has Derek been calling the pharmacy? Because someone's been calling and asking about your refills." I said I didn't think so. Frank nodded slowly. He said, "All right, I just wanted to mention it." We went back to talking about the weather moving in from the north. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. I held on to that for 6 more weeks. Derek and Carolyn came for lunch on a Sunday in early September. Carolyn brought a pie apple from the bakery on Clement Street, not homemade but a nice gesture. Derek fixed a kitchen drawer that had been sticking since spring. He didn't ask if I needed help. He just opened it, looked at the runner, went out to his car for a screwdriver, and fixed it. It felt like the old version of things. I let myself enjoy that for a few hours. After the dishes were cleared, Derek settled back in his chair, and his expression shifted in a way I recognized only later as rehearsed. He said he'd been thinking about my health. He said he wanted to make sure everything was properly managed, that if something ever happened quickly, there was someone positioned to help without delay. He said the word simplify twice. Then he asked whether I had considered a power of attorney arrangement, just something straightforward, just to give everyone peace of mind. I told him I had an attorney and that everything was handled. He nodded and didn't push. Carolyn smiled at her coffee cup. 3 days later, my phone rang at 8:30 in the morning. It was Frank. He didn't begin with pleasantries. He said, "Raymond, I need you to come in on a Tuesday." I was there by 9:15. Frank closed the small window at the pharmacy counter and came around to where I was standing. He had a notebook with him, a plain green notebook, the kind you'd find in any office supply aisle. He opened it and set it on the counter between us. There were 3 entries. Each one listed a date, a time, a name, and a summary of what was said. The first call had come 4 months earlier. Someone identifying himself as Derek Aldred, Raymond's son, had called to cancel the refill reminder notifications on my account. Frank had complied. The caller said his father got confused by the reminders and it caused unnecessary anxiety. It sounded plausible. Frank had no reason to question it. The second call came 6 weeks later. Same name, same voice. This time asking whether a specific prescription could be placed on a brief hold while the family reviewed my overall medication plan with my doctor. Frank told the caller he would need to hear from me directly before making any changes to the prescription itself. The caller said he understood and thanked Frank politely. Frank hung up and wrote down every detail. The third call came 3 weeks after that. Derek gave his name again without hesitation. He asked Frank to place the refill on indefinite hold. When Frank asked for clarification, Derek said, and Frank had written this down, word for word, he probably won't even notice. He gets confused about his schedule. I read that sentence twice. I did not speak for close to a full minute. I took photographs of every page with my phone. I thanked Frank. I drove home, sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Eleanor's pill organizer for a long time. I did not call Derek. There was nothing to say to him yet. What I needed to do first was think clearly, and thinking clearly has always required silence on my part. I knew what this was. It was not confusion. It was not concern. It was a pattern, deliberate and repeated, carried out under his own name, because he did not believe anyone was paying attention. He had badly miscalculated who was paying attention. I drove home that afternoon and sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I made 2 phone calls, not to Derek. I was done making excuses for that. I called my attorney. And I called Frank back. I had known Patricia for 11 years. Eleanor had found her when we were updating our wills, back when Derek was still calling on Sundays and the fence in the backyard was still straight. Patricia was methodical and plain-spoken, which is exactly what I needed from an attorney and exactly what Eleanor had looked for. I called her office on a Monday morning and had an appointment by Wednesday of the following week. I brought the photographs of Frank's notebook. I brought a written account I had typed out myself over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, a straightforward record of the Sunday calls, the estate conversation 8 months after Eleanor's funeral, the receptionist at the doctor's office mentioning Derek's inquiries, and the 3 pharmacy calls as Frank had documented them. I laid it all out in order, with dates where I had them. Patricia read through everything without interrupting. When she finished, she set the pages down and looked at me steadily and told me what my options were in general terms. I listened. Then I made several quiet decisions. The first was to confirm, in writing, that Derek held no power of attorney over my affairs, and to put a clear process in place ensuring that no such arrangement could move forward without my explicit, in-person consent. The second was to contact my doctor's office directly and leave a written instruction on file specifying that no family member was authorized to receive information about my prescriptions or make any changes to my care arrangements. I asked that this be noted prominently. The office manager said she understood. The third decision was to file a formal report with the County Adult Protective Services Office, not as a dramatic act, as a practical one. Patricia explained it simply. If the documentation existed as a formal record, it would exist regardless of what Derek did next or what story he chose to tell. I filled out the paperwork the following week. Frank drove me to Patricia's office that first Wednesday. He sat in the waiting room and read a magazine about woodworking that had been sitting on the side table since approximately the previous decade. When I came out, he looked up and said, "All right?" I said, "All right." We drove back through town, and he dropped me at my door without making anything more of it. During the 6 weeks that followed, Derek called every Sunday. I answered. I asked about his work. I mentioned that the weather had turned cold early. I said very little and gave nothing away. I did not call him. I did not confront him. I simply made sure that when the time came, the truth would be impossible to argue with. 6 weeks after I walked into Patricia's office, Derek called to say he wanted to visit. He said he had something he needed to discuss. I said, "Come on Sunday. I'll make coffee." They arrived at 10 in the morning. Derek was wearing the kind of careful, neutral expression that people wear when they have practiced what they are going to say. Carolyn carried herself quietly, a step behind him, the way she always did when Derek had decided something. I held the door open. I had made coffee. There was nothing on the kitchen table except 2 cups. We sat down. I did not offer anything else. I waited. Derek began the way he had clearly planned to begin, measured, concerned, reasonable. He said he had been worried about me. He said living alone at my age, with my particular health situation, was something the whole family thought about. He said he had spoken to a few people, he didn't say who, and the consensus was that having a formal arrangement in place would give everyone peace of mind. He reached into the folder he had brought and slid a document across the table toward me, a power of attorney form, already printed on clean white paper. A pen placed beside it, cap off. I looked at the document. I did not touch it. I picked up my coffee. Derek read my silence as hesitation and leaned forward slightly. He said the cardiac situation was not something to take lightly. He said I wasn't as young as I once was, which was true and which I did not need him to tell me. He said it would take a weight off everyone's mind. Carolyn nodded once, carefully. Then Derek said the sentence that completed his own undoing. He said, "Dad, you need someone looking out for you. You can trust me with this." I set my coffee down. I said, "I know about the calls to the pharmacy, Derek." The kitchen went quiet in a way that kitchens rarely do. Derek's face moved through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 2 seconds. I watched all 3 without looking away. I did not fill the silence. I had learned a long time ago that silence, held calmly, will always outlast the person who is afraid of it. Derek started to speak. He said he had been trying to help. He said he was concerned about over-medication, that he had read some things, that it was all coming from the right place. He said Raymond's doctor had actually mentioned, and then he stopped. He had just told me, without meaning to, that he had been in contact with my doctor's office. He understood this approximately 1 second after he said it. I reached down to the chair beside me, where I had placed a plain manila folder that morning before they arrived. Derek had not noticed the folder when he sat down. I opened it and placed Frank's written account on the table between us. 3 calls, dates, times, the exact wording of each request. Derek's full name, given voluntarily on every occasion. I found the entry for the 3rd call and read it aloud, once, at the same pace I would read anything else. He probably won't even notice. He gets confused about his schedule. I placed the page flat on the table. I folded my hands. I told Derek that a formal report had been filed with the appropriate county office. I told him that my legal arrangements were current, had been recently reviewed, and required no additional signatures from anyone. I told him that the power of attorney form he had brought could go home with him. I had not raised my voice in 40 years. I did not raise it that morning either. Carolyn stood up quietly and moved to stand near the front door. Derek remained at the table for a few minutes longer. He said once that I didn't understand the full picture. I told him I understood it completely. He picked up his folder He took the power of attorney form. He did not look at me when he left. I washed both cups. Then I called Frank. Section 8, the consequence cascade A&D emotional resolution. Frank picked up on the second ring. I told him it was done. He asked if I was all right. I said I was. He said he would see me Tuesday. I said I would bring the coffee this time. I sat at the kitchen table after I hung up, and I noticed that the room felt different somehow. Not lighter exactly, just honest. The way a room feels after you've finally fixed something that has been wrong for longer than you wanted to admit. Derek called 3 times over the following 4 days. I did not answer. On the 5th day, a text message arrived that was longer than any message he had sent me in years. He used the word misunderstanding 4 times. He said things had been taken out of context. He said he hoped we could talk when things settled down. I read it once, saved it to the folder I had been keeping, and set my phone face down on the counter. Carolyn called once, 2 days after that. She said Derek was very upset and that there had been a terrible misunderstanding on all sides. I thanked her sincerely for calling. I told her I hoped she was well. I ended the conversation politely, the way my mother had taught me to end conversations that had nowhere useful to go. A few weeks later, a caseworker from the county office contacted me to follow up on the report I had filed. She was professional and straightforward. She reviewed the documentation I provided, asked several clarifying questions, and then asked whether I wished to pursue anything further. I told her I wanted the record to exist. That was all I wanted. She said she understood and that she would proceed accordingly. The follow-up process meant that Derek received a formal contact from the agency. It was not a dramatic event as far as I know paperwork, a phone call, the kind of bureaucratic correspondence that arrives in a plain envelope. But this is a mid-sized town, and a mid-sized town has a long memory. Patricia had known Derek's mother-in-law from church for the better part of 2 decades. Word travels in the particular way it travels in places where people have lived their whole lives. I was told, through no effort of my own, that a certain phone call between Derek's mother-in-law and Carolyn had not gone pleasantly for anyone involved. Derek did not contact me again for 7 months. I want to be careful about how I say what came next. I did not close the door permanently. If Derek ever genuinely reckons with what he chose to do, I will not prevent that conversation from happening. But I do not spend my evenings waiting for it. I do not organize my days around the possibility. My medications are filled on schedule. My cardiologist is satisfied. My legal arrangements are current and reflect my actual wishes. Derek's name is not on any of them. The Tuesday after the confrontation, I walked to the diner next to Frank's pharmacy. Frank was already there when I arrived. There were 2 coffees on the table. We sat for an hour. We talked about a gutter at the back of my house that I wanted to repair before the first hard freeze, and about a book Frank had been working through for the past month. We did not spend much time on Derek. At the end of the hour, Frank said, "You doing all right?" I said, "Better than I've been in a while." He nodded. We left a tip on the table and walked back out into the cold morning air, each of us returning to our own particular life. It was a Tuesday. It was enough. People ask me sometimes if I regret how it ended. I tell them it didn't end. It just became honest. I still use Eleanor's pill organizer. Every morning before the first sip of coffee, I check it the same way I always have. It is a small discipline. It keeps me accountable to what I need and clear about what I am owed. I think Eleanor would have approved of both of those things. She was practical in exactly that way. I've thought a lot about the word family over these past months. It's a title when you examine it closely, and titles on their own don't carry weight. The weight comes from what a person actually does with them. I have a son. I also have a friend who noticed an empty compartment on a Tuesday morning and wrote down every detail in a plain green notebook because I mattered to him, not because he was obligated, not because there was anything in it for him, simply because paying attention to the people you care about is what you do when you actually care about them. Both of those things are true. Only one of them saved my life. If you have been the person in your family who gave quietly and was taken for granted, I want to say something directly to you. You were not foolish for giving. You were not weak for believing the best about someone for longer than they deserved. You were simply someone who loved honestly, and that is not a flaw. But there comes a point where loving honestly also means being honest about what you are looking at. The difference between someone who loves you and someone who needs something from you is not always loud. Sometimes it is as quiet as a canceled prescription. Sometimes it announces itself only when you finally stop making excuses for it. If you have had a Tuesday morning of your own, a moment when you realized who was actually in your corner and who had only been standing near you, I would like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story reached something in you today, subscribe to this channel. Every week, the silent father shows up, quietly, without announcement, and always with the truth. The man who saved my life did not share my name. He shared my Tuesday mornings. That turned out to be enough.